I need to tell you something before I start. I've been a military correspondent for 11 years. 11 years of covering conflicts, evacuations, treaty signings, court-martials, graduation ceremonies. You name it, I've probably stood in the back of the room with a recorder running and a notepad getting damp from whatever atmosphere I happened to be breathing that week. I've seen Kreth soldiers lift collapsed bulkheads with their bare hands. I've watched Tharan commanders hold entire battalions together through sheer force of presence. I've documented things that made my editors back on Proxima Station ask me if I was okay, actually okay, not just okay for someone who watched a siege. I say all of this because I need you to understand that I am not easy to impress. And then I was there for the 8 seconds. And now I'm sitting in a small pressurized bunk on Transit Ring 7 with a cup of something that's supposedly coffee. It's not. Nothing out here is really coffee, but I keep ordering it anyway because the ritual matters, and I'm trying to figure out how to write this down in a way that does it justice. I don't think I can, but I'm going to try. The Academy at the edge of everything. Orion Military Academy isn't the most famous military institution in the Galactic Cooperative. That title belongs to the Tharan War College on Selen Prime, which has been producing decorated officers for about 4,000 years and doesn't let anyone forget it. Orion doesn't have 4,000 years. It has 93. And for most of those 93 years, it existed mostly as a footnote, a mid-tier facility out past the Cassini Belt, notable mainly for being one of the few academies that accepted cadets from Earth. That last part matters. It matters a lot. Because Earth, humanity, humans, Deathworlders, as the rest of the cooperative had taken to calling us with a mix of fascination and mild existential unease, had only been in the Galactic Cooperative for 47 years. 47 years is nothing. The Kreth joined 600 years ago. The Tharan have been members for over a millennium. To the wider galaxy, humanity was still essentially the new kid who'd shown up to the dinner party uninvited, somehow eaten everything on the table without getting sick, fixed the dishwasher on the way out, and left everyone slightly uncertain how to feel about the whole encounter. We were new, we were strange. We were stubbornly, embarrassingly biological in ways that made other species uncomfortable. We didn't have the Tharan's natural combat telepathy. We didn't have the Kreth's reinforced skeletal structure. We didn't have the Veli's ability to go into metabolic stasis for weeks at a time. We had none of the elegant biological advantages that other species had spent millions of years evolving. What we had instead, and this is the part that kept making xenobiologists write frantic research papers, was a gravity well. Earth's gravity, 0.986 standard galactic units, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that most of the habitable planets in the cooperative sit somewhere between 0.2 and 0.6. Humans had evolved on a world that was, by galactic standards, actively trying to kill them from the moment they were born. Our bones were denser. Our muscles were denser. Our cardiovascular systems had developed to pump blood against a constant drag that would have exhausted most species within hours. And we'd done all of this while being persistently, stubbornly mortal. No regeneration, no hive mind, no biological armor, which meant we'd also developed the peculiar psychological adaptation of doing dangerous things anyway. The cooperative called it recklessness, humans called it Tuesday. Which brings me to Orion Military Academy, and to the year 3047, and to a training exercise called the Gauntlet, and to a 22-year-old human cadet named Marcus Vale. The morning it started, I arrived on Orion Station 3 days before the Gauntlet was scheduled to run. I was there to cover the annual Joint Training Review, a piece for the Cooperative Military Tribune about interspecies integration in modern academies. Standard assignment, mildly interesting. The kind of thing I could write with one eye on my recorder, and the other on the meal vouchers the Academy Public Affairs Office had very generously provided. Nobody had mentioned the Gauntlet to me specifically. It was listed in the schedule as Advanced Joint Combat Simulation, Day 3, which could mean anything from a complicated wargame with colored flags to an actual live-fire scenario in a pressurized dome. At Orion, it turned out to mean the latter, more or less. The first morning I was there, I had breakfast in the Academy's main commissary and got my first real look at the cadet population. Orion had students from 11 different species that year. 11, Kreth, who were 7 feet tall and roughly the density of a small moon. Tharin, who were slender and silver-skinned and communicated in overlapping harmonics when they thought no one else could hear. Veli, who resembled, if you squinted, something between a mantis and a very large moth, and who spent most mealtimes carefully sorting their food into 17 distinct categories before eating any of it. And humans. A cluster of about 30 of them, scattered around 2 long tables near the far wall, talking too loudly about something that had happened during yesterday's navigation drill. I recognized the human tendency to be loud in spaces where everyone else was quiet. It's a thing we do. I've done it myself in enough off-world settings that I've stopped being embarrassed about it. What I noticed, though sitting there with my not coffee and my press credentials and my recorder sitting dark on the table, was that the other species noticed the humans too, constantly, the way you notice something you haven't quite categorized yet. The Kreth cadets would glance over, study the table for a moment, and then look away with the careful deliberateness of people trying not to stare. The Veli seemed perpetually startled by the volume. The Tharin watched with something that might have been amusement or might have been academic curiosity. It was hard to tell with Tharin. And the humans, for their part, seemed entirely unbothered by being watched. That, I would come to understand, was also a Deathworlder trait. I met Marcus Vale on my second morning at the academy. I'm going to be honest with you, I almost didn't notice him. He was sitting by himself at the end of one of the human tables, not talking, not eating particularly enthusiastically, just working through something on a battered data tablet with the focus of someone who'd forgotten breakfast was also an option. He was average height for a human male, maybe 5 feet 11, which put him somewhere around the Tharin cadet's shoulder height and made him look, next to the Kreth, roughly like a very determined piece of furniture. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of hands that suggested he'd spent a significant portion of his childhood doing something physical outdoors. And his cadet uniform had the small, precise modifications that you see on cadets who take regulations seriously, without being the kind of person who'd ever report someone for a loose button. I noticed him because of the tablet. He was running simulations. Combat scenarios I realized when I leaned slightly to the right and caught a glimpse of his screen, which was rude of me, but I'm a journalist and we're professionally permitted a certain level of controlled nosiness. The scenarios weren't standard-issue academy training programs. They were custom. Someone had built them by hand, which in 3047 still took genuine expertise and a willingness to sit in front of a screen for hours adjusting variables that most cadets wouldn't have even known existed. I asked because that's what I do if I could sit down. He looked up from the tablet, brown eyes, the particular kind of tired that comes from sleeping enough but thinking too much, and then a small nod that managed to convey both yes, sure, and please don't make this take very long simultaneously. I told him I was press, covering the joint review. He said he knew. He'd seen my credentials at the check-in station. I asked what he was working on. He said the gauntlet. I asked if he was worried about it. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't have an answer, more the quiet of someone who's considering how honest they want to be with a stranger. Then he said, "No, not worried, just thinking through the geometry of it." The geometry. The spatial relationships, the sequence of events. Every scenario has a geometry, like a shape to the way things unfold. If you understand the shape, you understand where the pressure points are. I wrote that down, not because I knew I'd use it later. I just wrote it down because it was the kind of thing that sounds simple and isn't. He went back to his tablet. I finished my not coffee. And that was it that first morning. A 2-minute conversation with a quiet human cadet who was running combat simulations at breakfast. What the gauntlet actually was. Let me explain the gauntlet, because without understanding it, the 8 seconds don't make sense. The Orion Academy Gauntlet was a joint combat evaluation. It had been running in various forms for about 30 years, and the basic concept was this. A mixed team of cadets from multiple species would be deployed into a simulated combat environment. A large pressurized dome called the Arena, roughly 400 meters across, and subjected to escalating scenarios designed to test not just individual competence, but interspecies coordination under stress. The Arena was a marvel of engineering. Its internal environment could be shifted within minutes. atmospheric composition, gravity, temperature, visibility. It could generate holographic combatants that interacted with actual physical obstacles. It had real-time feedback systems that measured biometric stress indicators in every cadet inside. And it was, by design, difficult in a way that was calibrated specifically to be difficult for everyone, including species with significant biological advantages. The gauntlet wasn't designed to be winnable, not cleanly. It was designed to find your breaking point and watch what you did when you got there. The team assigned to that year's primary evaluation run included 4 Kreth cadets, 2 Tharan, 3 Veli, and 4 humans, one of whom was Marcus Vale. The evaluation was worth 30% of the year's combat assessment grade. It would be observed by a panel of 8 senior officers from 4 different species, including 2 cooperative Joint Command representatives who were visiting Orion specifically for the review. And it would be recorded in full, which is why, 11 years later, I can describe what happened in the kind of detail that still makes my hands shake a little when I type it. The day before, the afternoon before the gauntlet, the Academy held a standard pre-evaluation briefing in one of the larger lecture halls. All 13 cadets in the team were present, along with their respective squad leaders and the evaluation officers. I had a seat in the press observer section at the back. I had my recorder. I had, by this point, also had enough conversations around the Academy to have a rough sense of the interpersonal dynamics in the room. The Kreth cadets, I'd gathered, were confident in the way that comes naturally when you are 7 feet tall and made of something slightly harder than granite. Their squad leader, a 4th year named Vethkal, had won the previous year's individual combat evaluation and carried himself with the easy assurance of someone who had never been seriously tested and didn't particularly expect to be. He was impressive, genuinely impressive. But there was something in the way he looked at the human cadets, not contempt exactly, more a kind of careful patience, like a large predator at a nature preserve waiting for the smaller animals to finish their thing. The Tharan cadets were polite and precise and spoke very little out loud. They communicated in that overlapping harmonic way during the parts of the briefing where the evaluating officer was talking to the Kreth, and whatever they were saying, it made the senior Tharan officer at the front of the room allow a small smile that she immediately suppressed. The Veli cadets were quiet in the way that Veli usually were, attentive, careful, moving as little as possible to conserve energy, their large compound eyes tracking the room with the thoroughness of creatures who'd evolved to notice everything. And the human cadets were scattered. Not inattentive, but they were having a low-voiced side conversation about something that had happened during yesterday's navigation drill that apparently involved a miscalculated burn and someone's lunch going into freefall. One of them noticed me noticing them and gave a small wave. Humans. Marcus sat slightly apart from the other 3 human cadets. Not unfriendly, more like he was conserving something. He had the same tablet. He was still running simulations. The briefing covered the scenario parameters, the environmental variations the arena would be cycling through, the locations of the simulated enemy positions, and the rules of engagement. The evaluating officer, a Kreth colonel named Jethvarn, which I include because his reaction later matters, was methodical and precise, and went through the entire brief without looking at the human section of the room more than once. When he opened the floor for questions, one of the human cadets, a sharp-faced woman named Petra Holt, who I'd spoken to briefly the day before, raised her hand and asked about the gravity variation schedule in the second phase of the scenario. The colonel answered, standard stuff. Then Marcus raised his hand. Sir, in the third phase, the sector breach, the scenario parameters show the simulated hostile units converging from 2 directions, but there's a gap in the coverage at the northeast quadrant near the pressure seal. Is that intentional, or is it an artifact of the mapping? There was a pause. The colonel looked at Marcus with the specific expression of someone who has just been asked a question they did not expect. That gap, the colonel said carefully, is an intentional test variable. Cadets who identify it and exploit it will receive additional assessment credit. Marcus nodded, "Thank you, sir." The colonel held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then moved on. In the observer section, the 2 Joint Command representatives turned to each other and exchanged something. I didn't catch what it was. I wrote down that they exchanged something. Afterward, walking back through the academy corridors toward the press bunk block, I passed Marcus heading in the opposite direction. He had the tablet closed under his arm and his hands in his pockets, and the look of someone walking through a place they'd already memorized. I said, "Good catch in there, about the gap." He glanced over, the small nod again. It was there in the documentation if you read the addenda. Most people don't read the addenda. "I know," he said, and kept walking. Day of the gauntlet. I want to try to describe the arena the way it looked that morning, because the physical setting matters. From the observer gallery, a curved transparent section above and around the arena floor, giving a full 360 view, the arena looked at rest, like the inside of a very large drum. Smooth gray composite walls, a floor that could shift its texture from flat to broken to debris-strewn at a system command. Overhead lighting rigs that could simulate everything from full Terran daylight to the dim amber of a gas giant's inner atmosphere. That morning, as the cadets entered the arena floor in their team groups, the arena was set to something the briefing materials had described as contested urban corridor, which meant the floor was interrupted by simulated building facades, low concrete barriers, sections of raised walkway, and two large central structures that provided cover but also obscured sightlines. The lighting was reduced to about 60%, with a slight blue cast that approximated a world with a cooler sun. The atmospheric mix was heavier than standard, not enough to impair human function, but enough to create the sensation of breathing something slightly thicker than normal. From the gallery, I could see all 13 cadets as they entered and took their initial positions. The Kreth formed their natural cluster, centered, dominant, positioned to advance. The Tharan took a flanking spread without being told, which was pure instinct. The Veli, lighter and faster than any of the others, moved immediately to the elevated walkways. The 4 humans spread out in a looser pattern. 3 of them, Petra Holt and 2 others I knew as Cadet Dorsey and Cadet Ikena, moved to take positions behind the low barriers. Standard cover, smart play. Marcus went somewhere unexpected. He moved to a position that, from the gallery, looked at first like a mistake. A spot near the eastern wall, partially exposed, with no immediate cover advantage. I watched him settle there, and for a moment I was genuinely baffled. The position made no tactical sense. Then I remembered what he'd said at breakfast. The geometry. I looked at the arena map I'd been given in the press kit. I looked at where Marcus was standing. I looked at the gap in the third phase coverage that he'd identified in the briefing. And I understood, not fully, not yet, but enough, that he was standing exactly where the geometry required someone to stand. He'd worked this out, not just the simulation on his tablet. He'd worked out the whole thing, the full sequence, start to finish, before he ever set foot on the arena floor. The evaluation officer's voice came over the arena's address system, crisp, neutral, final. Gauntlet evaluation, year cohort 3047. Phase 1 commences on my mark. A pause. Mark. The first 2 phases. I'll try to give you the first 2 phases without losing you in the tactical details, because the tactical details in phases 1 and 2, while genuinely impressive, aren't the point. Phase 1 was a perimeter defense. The simulated hostiles, full holographic, but with physical impact rigs that made contact real enough to register, came from the northern corridor in 2 waves. The Kreth handled the front engagement with the kind of efficiency that made the observer gallery murmur appreciatively. Veth Kal, the Kreth squad leader, moved like something assembled specifically for this purpose, and his cadets followed him with practiced precision. The Tharan coordinated the flanks without a word passing between them out loud. Perfect communication. Perfect positioning. The kind of thing that makes you understand, very quickly, why Tharan had won more cooperative military decorations than any other species in the last 3 centuries. The Veli on the walkways provided elevated cover, and called out position changes in their rapid clicking language, which got translated into a shared comm channel in real time. The humans did their part. Petra Holt was genuinely good, fast, accurate, decisive. Dorsey had a particular skill with the simulated energy rifles that the cadets were carrying. Ikena held his position under pressure with a steadiness that the observer gallery noted. Marcus, from his unusual eastern position, did something in phase 1 that I almost missed. He didn't fire much. He watched, he tracked. He shifted position twice in small, precise increments, like he was calibrating something in his head. Phase 1 ended with the first wave repelled and the second redirected. The joint panel made notes. The observer gallery, which included, I should mention, a significant number of academy instructors, senior cadets from other cohorts, and a handful of journalists including myself, was quiet in that particular way that means professional observers are paying close attention. Phase 2 was the corridor push. The team needed to advance through the central section of the arena while simulated hostile units shifted positions to intercept. This was where things got more complicated, because the atmospheric mix dropped another fraction and the lighting shifted to the amber register, and suddenly the arena felt like somewhere genuinely different from the cool blue urban corridor of Phase 1. The Kreth adapted immediately. Their biology wasn't affected by the atmospheric shift. The Tharan adjusted their positioning to compensate for the reduced visibility, spreading further apart to maintain their communication range. The Veli, interestingly, became slightly more effective in the amber light, which their compound eyes apparently found easier to process. The humans slowed, not dramatically, but I could see it from the gallery, the small extra effort that the atmospheric shift was costing them. Petra Holt wiped her hand across her face at one point. Dorsey's movements got slightly more deliberate. Ikena compensated by moving closer to the Kreth element, which was smart, using the Kreth as a windbreak, essentially, letting them cut through the environmental resistance. Marcus didn't slow. I watched him specifically because he'd been puzzling me since Phase 1. He was moving through the corridor push with a quality I can only describe as ease, not the practiced efficiency of the Kreth or the fluid grace of the Tharan, but something more basic than that. Something that looked almost like he was in a better environment than everyone else, not a worse one. Later, much later, in the debrief and in the research I did afterward, I found out that Marcus Vale had grown up in a high-altitude agricultural region on Earth's South American continent. Thin air, cold, terrain that required the body to constantly fight for purchase. He'd spent his childhood working in conditions that made the arena's atmospheric adjustment look like a slightly breezy day. The gauntlet was calibrated to challenge every species in the room. It hadn't been calibrated for Marcus Vale's childhood. Phase 2 completed. The team reached the central extraction point. The joint panel made more notes. The observer gallery shifted with the restless energy of people who could feel that something was building toward something, even if they couldn't yet say what. In the press observer section, the journalist sitting next to me, a Tharan correspondent from the Cooperative Dispatch, leaned over and said, in the soft overlapping harmonics that Tharan use for close confidential speech, "The human in position 7 is not what the scenario expected." I said, "No, he's not." The Tharan correspondent made the gesture that serves, in Tharan body language, as a nod of acknowledgement. Then we both turned back to the arena floor. Phase 3 was about to begin. The third phase, what the geometry required. I want to pause here and take a breath, because I've been building toward this for a while, and I want to make sure I get it right. Phase 3 of the gauntlet was called the sector breach. In the briefing, it had been described as a high-intensity multi-vector engagement, which is military language for everything happens at once from multiple directions, and your job is to not collapse. The arena reconfigured between phases. The corridor push layout dissolved and reformed into something new, a large open central space surrounded by the building facades and barriers, with 3 clear approach corridors running into it from different angles. The lighting dropped further. The atmospheric mix shifted again, this time adding a light particulate, not harmful but visually disruptive, like very fine smoke drifting through the amber light. The hostiles would come from all 3 corridors simultaneously. The team would need to hold the central space long enough for the simulated objectives to be secured. 2 data units positioned on opposite sides of the open area, while preventing the hostile units from reaching them. And there was the gap, the northeast quadrant near the pressure seal, the intentional test variable. I want to explain what that gap meant tactically. The 3 approach corridors were covered. The Kreth, the Tharan, the Veli, they were positioned and capable, and the gap was in theory survivable without being specifically defended. You could let the hostile units through the gap and deal with them once they'd entered the open area. Messy, but viable. Or, and this was the point of the test variable, you could position someone in that gap. Someone who could hold a narrow corridor against an incoming hostile force, long enough for the rest of the team to secure both objectives and fall back. The thing about holding a narrow corridor is that it's a specific kind of problem. It's not about firepower or speed or biological advantage. It's about, and this is the word that kept coming back to me, geometry. About understanding the shape of the space and the sequence of the threat and the exact position where one person becomes a choke point that stops 20. It's also about something else, something harder to quantify. It's about not stepping back. Phase 3 began. The 3 corridors erupted simultaneously, holographic units pouring through, physical impact systems active, the arena suddenly full of noise and motion, and that amber-lit particulate that turned everything slightly unreal. In the observer gallery, people leaned forward. The Kreth held the southern corridor. Vethkal was extraordinary, I'll give him that, unambiguously and completely. He held that corridor like he'd been born holding it, which in some evolutionary sense he had. 2 of his cadets flanked him, and the southern approach became, very quickly, a non-problem. The Tharan and Veli managed the eastern corridor in a coordinated 2-layer system that I later heard 2 of the joint panel members describe as textbook interspecies tactical integration. It was beautiful to watch, honestly. Efficient and elegant and entirely synchronized without a word spoken aloud. The western corridor was the Petra Holt problem. She and Dorsey and Ikena were there, and they were good. But the hostile volume from the western approach was higher than the other 2 corridors, which was the scenario's way of testing whether the humans would call for support or try to hold alone. They called for support. Ikena moved toward the Kreth element, flagging the situation. Vethkal peeled off one of his cadets to reinforce the western corridor. Good decision, right call. The kind of adaptive coordination the joint panel was there to assess. And in the northeast quadrant, near the pressure seal, in the gap that most cadets would have either missed or flagged as secondary, Marcus Vale was already there. He'd moved there at the start of Phase 3 before anyone else had processed the reconfigured layout. He was standing in a corridor that was narrow enough that 2 people would have struggled to walk through it side by side, with a shallow alcove in the left wall that provided maybe 30% body coverage. He had his simulation rifle raised, and he was looking at the far end of the corridor, which was dark and still. For about 15 seconds after Phase 3 began, nothing came through that corridor. I was watching him specifically from the gallery. I don't know why. I'd been tracking all 13 cadets, but my eyes kept returning to him, standing in that narrow northeast gap, completely alone in the amber-lit particulate waiting. The person sitting next to me, one of the academy instructors who'd gotten a press-adjacent seat in the observer section, said quietly, "That position. He shouldn't be able to hold that position." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because we're about to find out what they're sending through there." 8 seconds. The hostile units came through the northeast corridor at the 50-second mark of Phase 3. Later, from the recording, I was able to count them. There were 9 simulated hostile units in that corridor. 9. The scenario designers had concentrated a disproportionate force in the gap, specifically because the gap was the test variable, specifically because the intent was that someone would identify it and try to hold it, and the scenario needed to know what happened when they did. 9 units, configured as heavy assault, the physical impact systems running at full evaluation intensity. In the simulation parameters, each unit was rated at something slightly above baseline Kreth infantry capability, which was, to put it plainly, not a simulation you wanted to face alone in a narrow corridor. The gap was designed to be untenable. It was designed to be the thing that broke the person holding it, so the team could observe how the breach was managed, how the rest of the team adapted when the choke point failed. The scenario had not been designed for Marcus Vale. I'm going to try to describe what I saw from the gallery. I want to be honest that my description is imperfect. Things happened quickly. The particulate made the arena slightly difficult to see clearly even from above, and there was a moment in the middle of it where I realized I'd stopped breathing and had to deliberately start again. The 9 units came around the far corner of the northeast corridor in a rush. Marcus didn't move back. He dropped his sightline, not in hesitation, but in what I later understood was a deliberate shift, targeting the lead unit's physical impact system housing. The simulation hit registered. The lead unit faltered. The second unit moved up. Marcus stepped forward, not back forward. One step. Narrow corridor, 9 hostile units, and he stepped forward, which compressed the space further, which meant the units couldn't spread laterally, which turned 9 units into one at a time. That's geometry. He took a hit from the third unit. The impact system caught him in the left shoulder, which at full evaluation intensity produces a genuine physical shock, not simulated, because the Academy's philosophy was that simulation had to have real stakes to produce real data. I saw him absorb it. I saw his shoulder drop for a fraction of a second. He didn't step back. He fired twice in rapid succession, not at the unit that had hit him, but at the 2 behind it, targeting the corridor geometry to create a stagger effect. The 2 units went down. The one that had hit him was now isolated. He dealt with it in one movement that was so fast and so economical that it took me 3 viewings of the recording to parse what he'd actually done. That was 6 seconds in. A second hit his side lower this time. I heard the impact from the gallery, a sound like something solid meeting something equally solid. Marcus's breathing was audible on his comm channel, which the gallery speakers were carrying live. Not panic, not pain, or not just pain. It was the breathing of someone who has a task and is doing it. He didn't step back. 7 seconds. The remaining 6 units were pushing through the corridor. In the scenario parameters, this was the moment of breach, the moment the gap failed, the moment the rest of the team needed to pivot and manage the northeast intrusion. The joint panel was watching. The Academy instructors in the observer gallery were watching. The Tharan correspondent next to me had stopped writing anything down and was simply watching. 8 seconds. Marcus Vale raised his simulation rifle from a position that biomechanically should not have been stable. His left shoulder compromised, his side hit, the corridor geometry compressing from 6 remaining units pushing forward, and fired in a sequence that I can only describe as the opposite of desperation. It wasn't wild. It wasn't lucky. It was precise in the way that things are precise when someone has already worked out the geometry and is executing against a plan rather than reacting to chaos. 3 units, 2 units. 1. And then the northeast corridor was clear. 9 hostile units neutralized, chokepoint held. 8 seconds. Marcus Vale lowered his rifle. I could see him clearly from the gallery, the particulate drifting around him, the amber light catching the left shoulder of his uniform where the impact had hit, his chest moving with the deliberate, controlled breathing of someone who is choosing to be steady rather than naturally arriving there. He didn't step back. Not once. Not in 8 seconds. The corridor was clear. I want to describe the observer gallery in the moment after. Silence. Real silence, not the quiet of polite attention, but the kind of absence of sound that happens when a large group of people have all simultaneously run out of things to say. Academy instructors, senior cadets, joint command representatives, journalists, all of us just quiet. The Tharan correspondent to my left made a sound that I'd never heard a Tharan make before. Not the overlapping harmonics of communication, something shorter, sharper. Surprise, I realized later. I was hearing a Tharan express genuine surprise. The joint panel, 6 meters to my right along the gallery, had stopped making notes. On the arena floor, the rest of the team was holding their positions. The western corridor secured, the eastern and southern corridors held, the 2 data objectives intact. The scenario clock was still running. The team had won Phase 3. They'd won it because the gap held. And then the comm channel carrying Marcus's audio still live on the gallery speakers, cracked slightly, and we heard him say, in a voice that was quiet and slightly rougher than it had been at the briefing, to no one in particular or maybe to the corridor walls. That's 7, geometry's right, 2 more in reserve, probably north-facing. Give them 15 seconds. He was still calculating. The Academy instructor next to me, the one who'd said Marcus shouldn't be able to hold that position, exhaled slowly. Then she said, very quietly, more to herself than to anyone in the gallery. He planned it before he went in. The debrief. The formal debrief happened 2 hours after the gauntlet concluded. I was permitted to observe the first portion, the general evaluation summary, but not the individual cadet assessments. What I can tell you is what Colonel Jethvarn, the Kreth evaluating officer who had barely looked at the human cadets during the pre-evaluation briefing, said when he opened the debrief. He said, and I have this in my recorder word for word, the team performance exceeded expected parameters in 3 of 4 phase metrics. Phase 3 sector breach response was statistically anomalous. The Northeast Corridor hold was executed at a level that falls outside the standard evaluation matrix. We will be reviewing the scenario parameters. He paused. Then he said, Cadet Vale will be noted in the joint evaluation record. In Kreth military culture, being noted in the joint evaluation record is roughly equivalent to being handed a medal. Kreth officers don't often note individual performance of non-Kreth cadets. It's not prejudice exactly. It's more that the assessment framework tends to weight biological capability heavily, and humans don't score well on biological capability. Vethkal, the Kreth squad leader who'd held the southern corridor with that practiced efficiency. I saw him, across the debrief room, turn and look at Marcus Vale with an expression that was no longer the patient tolerance of a large predator at a nature preserve. It was something else. Something that took me a moment to identify, because it was genuine and unguarded, and I hadn't expected to see it on a Kreth face that day. It was respect. After, I found Marcus in the commissary again that evening. Not by plan. I was getting my not coffee, and he was there at the same end of the same table, except this time he didn't have the tablet. His left shoulder was wrapped in the kind of biofoam brace the Academy Medical Bay gave for impact injuries. Real ones, not simulated. He was sitting with one of the other human cadets, Petra Holt, who was talking about something that had happened in the Western Corridor, and using her hands to draw shapes in the air the way people do when they're recounting something they're still processing. I sat nearby, not intruding. But Marcus looked up, saw me, and gave me the small nod. I asked if the shoulder was okay. He said it was fine, impact bruising, nothing structural. I said, meaning it. What you did in that corridor today, I've been covering military reporting for 11 years, and I've never seen anything like it. He looked at me for a moment, not with false modesty, with something more honest than that. Like he was considering whether what I'd said was accurate and deciding how to respond to accuracy. I didn't do anything special, he said finally. I just didn't move. Petra Holt stopped drawing shapes in the air and looked at him. Marcus, you held 9 evaluation intensity hostiles in a narrow corridor for 8 seconds, with a hit in the shoulder at second 3. I know. That's not I just didn't move. It kind of is, he said, and there was nothing in his voice that was false or performative. He meant it. The geometry tells you where to stand. The scenario tells you what's coming. The math tells you it's holdable. After that, it's just not moving. Petra looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard something that is clearly incomplete, but cannot yet identify what the missing piece is. I thought I could identify it. The math tells you it's holdable. But knowing the math and standing there anyway, standing there with 9 units coming through and an impact that cracked your shoulder at second 3 and not moving, not once, that's not the math. That's something else. I didn't say this to Marcus. I think he knew it was there. I think that's exactly what he was choosing not to name. What happened next? I'm going to skip forward a few days, because the story of what happened next is partly public record, and partly something I pieced together from conversations, and the recording, and the papers that got written afterward. The joint evaluation record noting was not, it turned out, the end of it. The 2 Joint Command representatives who had been observing the gauntlet, a Tharan senior commander named Lyseth Vaughn and a human admiral named Carla Mbeki, who was one of the 8 humans in the entire cooperative to hold flag rank, reviewed the recording. In full, multiple times. Admiral Mbeki, by the account of someone who was in the room, watched the Northeast Corridor footage 3 times and then turned to Commander Lyseth Vaughn and said, "That's what Earth's gravity does. 47 years, and we're still figuring out what it made us." Commander Lyseth Vaughn, who had the manner of someone who spent most of her working life being difficult to impress, watched the footage once more and then said something in Tharan that didn't translate cleanly but carried, roughly, the sense of a thing that should not be possible, demonstrated clearly. The joint evaluation record was filed. Marcus Vale's performance in the Northeast Corridor was classified as an exceptional anomalous result and flagged for long-term tracking, which in cooperative military terms means they wanted to watch what he became. A copy of the recording made its way, through channels I'll describe as informal, into broader circulation. I know this because 3 weeks later, sitting in my bunk on a transit vessel between Orion Station and Proxima, I started getting messages from colleagues at other outlets asking if I'd seen the Gauntlet footage. I said yes, I was there. The messages that came back were all variations of the same thing. What was that? I wrote back, a 22-year-old human cadet from a high-altitude agricultural region on Earth, standing in a corridor he'd already mapped, doing math that he worked out before he went in, and not moving. Most of my colleagues found this answer unsatisfying. They wanted something more dramatic. They wanted a story about adrenaline and instinct and the moment a cadet became a soldier. But that's not what it was. Marcus Vale didn't become something in those 8 seconds. He was already something. The 8 seconds just made it visible. What Marcus said to me. My last morning at Orion Academy, before I boarded the transit vessel back toward the inner systems, I ran into Marcus one more time. He was in the corridor outside the commissary, heading somewhere with the tablet under his arm again, the biofoam brace still on his shoulder, and the look of someone who had somewhere to be and was already thinking about it. I stopped him. I said, I'm going to write about the Gauntlet, about the corridor, about what you did. He stopped walking. Okay. Is there anything you want me to include? Anything you want people to understand about it? He thought about this, long enough that I wondered if he was going to wave it off and go wherever he was going. Then he said, tell them it wasn't brave. I said, what do you mean? I mean everyone's going to say it was brave, and it wasn't, not in the way they'll mean it. Brave is when you're scared and you do it anyway. I wasn't scared. What were you? A pause. The corridor hummed with the Academy's environmental systems. Somewhere deeper in the building, cadets were starting another morning of training drills. I was certain, he said. I knew the geometry, I knew the math, I knew it was holdable, so I held it. He looked at me steadily. The scary part would have been moving back. Moving back would have meant I'd gotten the geometry wrong, and I knew I hadn't. So moving back wasn't an option. He shifted the tablet under his arm. Write that if you want. That not moving was the easier choice because the math was right. That's the true part. He nodded once, the same small, precise nod from the commissary on the first morning, and walked away. I stood in the corridor for a moment with my recorder running and no words coming. What I didn't write then, I'm writing it now, 11 years later. I didn't write the thing that was true but unprovable. I wrote the facts, cadet, corridor, 8 seconds, 9 units, result. I wrote about the geometry and the math and the evaluation record. I wrote about the observer gallery going quiet. I wrote about Vethkal's expression. I didn't write what I actually believe, which is this. Marcus Vale wasn't just applying geometry in that corridor. He was demonstrating something about humans, about what 47 years of adapting to a galaxy that hadn't expected us had actually done to us, about what it means to come from a world that your own biology spent 1,000,000 years trying to overcome. Humans are afraid. We're afraid all the time. We're one of the most fear-responsive species in the cooperative, neurologically speaking. We feel danger acutely. We are not, by biology, suited to standing in narrow corridors while 9 high-intensity impact systems come toward us. What we are suited to, what Earth's gravity and Earth's predators and Earth's relentless, difficult, beautiful, terrible planet made us, is continuing anyway. Not without fear, not without the math, but continuing. Marcus wasn't afraid in that corridor because he'd already done the frightening part. He'd done it alone, at a commissary table, at 6 in the morning, with a tablet and a cup of something that wasn't coffee, working through geometry that no one had asked him to work through. He was afraid then, I think, in the quiet, private way that competent people are afraid, not of the task, but of being wrong, of the math being off, of having misjudged the geometry. He did the fear part before the event, so when the event came, all that was left was the certainty. And he stood in it. 8 seconds. Afterward, the record. From the Cooperative Military Historical Archive, Year 3059 Addendum, Orion Military Academy Exceptional Performance Registry, Cadet Marcus Vale, Human Earth, Joint Cohort 3047, Gauntlet Phase 3, Northeast Sector Hold. 9 hostile simulation units, full evaluation intensity, single cadet engagement, 0 breach. Duration, 8 seconds. 0 retrograde movement recorded. Classified, exceptional anomalous result. Flagged for long-term observational tracking per Joint Command Directive 7 Gamma. Post Note Year 3052, Subject commissioned as Lieutenant, Cooperative Joint Forces Command. Post Note Year 3055, Subject promoted Captain. Post Note Year 3058, Subject promoted Commander, Cooperative Strategic Operations. Observational tracking, continuing per original directive. From the personal log of Tharan Correspondent Yenny Tha, Orion Military Academy, Year 3047, recovered and published Year 3061. I have covered 17 military evaluation events across 9 different academies on 6 worlds. I have watched Kreth cadets hold fortified positions against odds that should be physically impossible. I have watched Tharan tactical units execute coordination sequences of a precision that made the human cadets around them look, by comparison, like very enthusiastic children playing at something they did not yet understand. I was not prepared for the Northeast Corridor. Not because of what the human cadet did exactly, but because of the quality of it. Because standing in an observer gallery above an arena watching a 22-year-old in a biofoam-bound shoulder hold a choke point that the scenario designers had intended to be a failure mode, I felt something that I had not expected to feel. I felt that humanity was going to be fine. Not because they are the strongest, not because they are the fastest, not because they have biological advantages that other species lack, but because they are the species that does the math before the corridor and then stands in the corridor and does not move back. I think in 47 years, the galaxy has not yet understood what it is hosting. 8 seconds, I keep coming back to 8 seconds. I don't think I'll stop. The ending. I'm almost done, let me finish with this. 6 years after the Gauntlet, I was covering a diplomatic summit on Selen Prime, Tharan territory, grand architecture, the kind of meeting where 400 representatives of 30 different species spent 3 days deciding things that would shape the next 50 years of cooperative policy. The kind of event where I was very much a small detail in a very large picture. On the second day, during a break in the afternoon session, I was standing in one of the corridor rotundas near the main chamber, trying to find something that was actually coffee, when someone said my name. I turned. Marcus Vale was a commander by then. The uniform was different, the insignia was different, but the quality of attention was the same, that precise focus. The sense of someone who had already thought through the geometry of whatever room they were standing in. He looked older, not in a bad way, in the way that people who take their work seriously look older, with the lines around their eyes that come from years of sustained concentration. He said, I read your piece, the one from Orion. I said, I didn't include everything I wanted to. I know, I could tell. A pause. The thing you left out about being afraid before, not during. Yes. That was the right call, leaving it out. Why? He thought about it. Around us, representatives of 30 species moved through the rotunda, talking in 16 different languages about things that mattered enormously and would be mostly forgotten in a century. Because the people who need to understand it, he said, already do. And the people who don't, they need the version with the 8 seconds. They need the thing they can see. You give them the 8 seconds, and eventually some of them will work backward to the commissary table at 6 in the morning, and that's enough. He paused. That's how it spreads. I looked at him. What spreads? He glanced around the rotunda, at the Kreth representatives, the Tharan, the Veli, the dozen other species that made up the cooperative and had been, for 47 years, quietly figuring out what to do with humanity. The understanding, he said, that we're not reckless, that we did the math. That we don't move back because we know the geometry, not because we're too stubborn to know we should. He shifted his weight slightly, an old habit I realized, the small recalibration of stance, someone who was always on some level checking where they stood. We're not a mystery, he said. We're just from somewhere hard, and that makes certain things, he glanced toward the northeast corner of the rotunda almost certainly without thinking about it, easier. He nodded once, the same small, precise nod. Then he walked toward the main chamber, where the future was being arranged, and I stood in the rotunda with my recorder running and thought about 8 seconds in geometry, and the morning he'd been at a commissary table working something out that no one had asked him to work out. And I thought about what it means to stand somewhere and not step back. Not because you aren't afraid, not because you're made of something harder than fear, but because you already did the afraid part alone in the quiet before anyone was watching. And then you went and stood in the corridor. And the corridor was exactly what the geometry said it would be. And you stayed. You don't have to be the strongest. You don't have to be the fastest. You just have to do the math. And then not move.